The only time that this can be problematic is when a reader insists that their Laura is the only Laura. So we've experienced the confrontations where a fan will get very angry with us and my Laura would never do that. Okay, but my Laura might. So,
and then you're back to which Laura are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Which Laura wins? All of them.
Welcome to Land of Laura, the irreverent yet scholarly podcast about all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. Dr. Dawn Sardella Ayers is a scholar in girls' literature who got her PhD in 2016 at the University of Cambridge. Throughout her career, she's researched and written extensively on girls' literature authors Louisa May Alcott, Lucy Maud Montgomery, and Laura Ingalls Wilder. Her essay, It All Depends on How You Look at It, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Rose Wilder Lane, Independence Day, and Family Economics, was included in the 2019 essay collection, Reconsidering Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House, and Beyond. Recently, Dawn has been teaching virtual classes on girls' literature through the Newberry Library in Chicago. Her next class, which focuses on Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Little House books, starts in just a few weeks. So listen in for details on that and a whole bunch of other stuff on Girls Lit. Dawn, welcome to the Land of Laura studio.
Thank you so much, Sandra. This is so much fun to be here. Let's gab.
Let's gab. As you probably know, we start every episode with a new guest with that guest's origin story. So, if you can, what is your Little House origin story and how did it inform who you became as an adult?
Mine's kind of a two-parter. I have the childhood discovery of Laura, and that was when I was about 9 years old. Early fourth grade, I still remember the classroom. I still remember all of the details, and I was reading ahead in my school reader because I was probably bored with math lessons or something. And in it was the story of the two bears from Little House in the Big Woods, Pa and the Bear in the Way. And I remember reading that and Laura describing her crinkle of fear that ran up her backbone. Immediately, I recognized that feeling. This was something visceral. This was something I understood. The fact that a 9-year-old child understands that visceral crinkle of fear probably lets you know that I didn't have the greatest childhood. Recognizing that another child understood those emotions was what I gravitated towards. So lunch recess, I went to the library, I grabbed Little House in the Big Woods, I checked it out, I devoured it, and I know I probably read the whole series within a couple of weeks. The book that I read after that, I remember, was Little Town on the Prairie, because I was aware of the TV show. My mom and grandma watched the TV show on Monday nights, and I remember thinking, oh, this is probably when they got Albert. And of course it wasn't, but that was like the first seed of critical reading, like understanding that there are multiple versions of this story, multiple versions of this character. But the most important thing for me is that my family didn't look like that. My home life did not look like that. It was a lot of chaos, a lot of problems. So I was reading Little House as fantasy. I didn't want to read Narnia. I didn't want to read Roald Dahl. I didn't want to read about worlds that you had to learn new rules. I wanted to read about worlds that I understood on some level. So for me, Little House was escapist fantasy. I began incorporating that into like playing with my Barbies. My Barbies had a shoebox covered wagon. They still have a shoebox covered wagon. They're in my garage. I would build like, one of these days I'm going to build my Barbies a log cabin. I would build like a brick house out in Grandma's backyard, and they would take their shoebox covered wagon there, and I'd dig a pit, and that was their fishing pond. And all of my Barbies crossed the prairie many, many times, but it was an imaginative world that I built out of my childhood reading and pop culture. So the prairies, or what I thought of as the prairies, existed next to, say, Tatooine. What I thought of as the moors of England from The Secret Garden and The Little Princess. There was a Victorian attic, of course. So this hybrid fantasy world was where I escaped. And that became a safe place for me as a child. So when I say that these books helped me survive childhood, that's not hyperbole. Then there's the second origin story as a scholar. I am a first-generation college student, and I spent 8 years at community college before I could go away for undergrad. And in community college, while I was working at a bookstore, I started taking classes on Native American history and Native American literature, and immediately recognizing, oh, these are the places where the Ingalls family was, or where the Wilder family was. And these are the stories from the people who lived there. We didn't have the term countertexts at the time, but that's what I started doing, was using firsthand, usually women's voices, and talking about things like matrilineal storytelling, patrilineal storytelling. Laura wanted to preserve Pa's stories. Why not Ma's stories? And like I said, I was working at a bookstore, so I was able to order stuff as it was coming out. Ghost in the Little House, the Rose books when they first came out, early 90s. But also I got to work with Paula Gunn Allen when Spider-Woman's Granddaughters came out, and to talk with her and other Native American scholars, writers, poets about how to incorporate or how to challenge or how to use Little House as a way of highlighting the stories that were erased, the stories that readers weren't aware of. When Dr. Allen let me know that I could use my voice, my whiteness, my ways in with Wilder to highlight Native American voices, I took that very seriously as a scholar. And that's something I've done with my entire career. So around this time, again, it's like, what are the real stories? And this is when I discovered, oh, Donald Zokert's book. Wait, what's going on here? This is different. When I discovered Roger Lee McBride's biography of Rose Wilder Lane, wait a minute, this sounds different. And those critical questions. What is the quote unquote true story? What's the real story? Wait a minute. There were people living with them during the long winter. These critical questions about the truth. What I've told is true, but it's not the whole truth. What is the whole truth? Can we find the whole truth? One of the things I read as I read the original Little House books was On the Way Home and the first 4 years. And that's where you start to see and hear a very different Laura. So I remember reading the first 4 years and really not understanding why it sounded so different and felt so different. Again, the first critical thinking questions that you start asking. But at the back of that, there was the notation about Laura and Almanzo moving to Missouri, and that the bread plate that had been salvaged from the fire was on display there. 9, 10-year-old me went, oh my God, I have to get there someday. Of course, to a little kid growing up in San Diego, without a lot of money and without other people who were interested, there was no chance. I mean, I might as well ask to go to the moon. So this is around my early 20s. I wrote to the Rocky Ridge Museum to ask some questions. Hi, I loved these books when I was a kid. Can you tell me what happened to Ma's China Shepherdess? What happened to, are these things, do they still exist? I got a letter back from Jean Cody saying, Carrie had the China Shepherdess, but it wasn't known to be in existence. Yes, the bread plate is still here and you can come see it. She answered a few of my questions, sent me pamphlets for the booklets that were on sale. So I was able to start to see a much wider and very different, quote unquote, epic story of the Ingalls family and the Wilder families, and how they both fit and don't fit into our kind of mythologized American history. But yeah, as an adult, when I finally got to go to Mansfield and saw that bread plate, and like in my head, here you go, little 10-year-old Dawn, check this out. And I cried like a little baby.
So how did you start to actually study the work of Laura Ingalls Wilder?
We have a joke in children's literature that we tend to stumble sideways into it. I started off as a modernist. So we're taking classes on modernism and Willa Cather or Ernest Hemingway or John Steinbeck. And a lot of this is covering some of the same either physical or thematic territory as Little House. Why don't we talk about that too? Well, those are children's books. We don't, those aren't real literature. Okay, but in this class, we're talking about Little Women. So why not Little House? Why not Anne of Green Gables? Why not Pollyanna? By the time I get to my master's degree, we're taking classes on Gothic literature and everyone's writing about Wuthering Heights or Daphne du Maurier. And I'm like, let's talk about the Gothic prairies in Little House. Seeing the fascination and the terror of homesteading is a very American Gothic experience. There was so little work being done critically. I saw an opening and ran for it and discovered that there was next to no critical work being done on children's literature and specifically literature for girls. When I got to Cambridge, within the first week, I went to a talk being given by one of the other students there. She was talking about Jean Webster, who wrote Daddy Longlegs. and Just Patty and When Patty Goes to College, which are just delightful, if problematic, texts. And I was the only one there who actually knew the books and had a very hard to find Jean Webster biography. So afterwards, I went up and introduced myself to Ashley Reese, and we started talking about our primary texts, discovered that we both loved the same books, were working on some of the same books, and we knew we were going to be bosom chums as soon as we discovered that our favorite Ellen Montgomery book is The Blue Castle, which is, again, just an incredible text. Ashley and I paired up to share resources and to work together on things. We were trying to define girls' literature. So we had the same supervisor, my academic mom, Maria Nikolieva. And so whenever we would turn in something where we would talk about classic books for girls or girls' literature, she would keep telling us, no, you need to define these terms. And we kept telling her we cannot find an academic definition of girls' lit. It turns out that work had been done on girls' lit in Scandinavian texts, Flickböcker, books for young girls. And so Maria had taught in Sweden for 20 odd years. So she understood that there was existing girls' lit scholarship, but it was in Swedish. It hadn't been touched in English language scholarship. There was not a working definition of girls' literature, which kind of suggests that girls' literature is already understood as something without a definition. This meant that Ashley and I got to write our own definition, because what else are you going to do with a PhD? It doesn't count unless you come up with your own terminology. So we ended up having to come up with our own definitions, discovered that it did not exist in English language texts, and we were focusing on American and Canadian girls in particular. Books from England don't focus on individual girls. They tend to be the family story. And yet in Canada and America, you will see the single individual girl, even if she's part of a family, she stands out. Jo March, Pollyanna, Anne Shirley, Emily Birdstar, Betsy Ray. They stand out as individuals, which is very important to national ideology. We saw a lack of scholarship. And considering everything that's going on in the world today, definitions of girls, definitions of girlhood, problematic definitions, people referring to 12, 13, 14-year-old girls as quote-unquote women, these are all issues that are still with us. How are we defining girls? How do girls function in our society? So the question that I'm always asking about these books is, what does it look like to be a girl or woman in this world, in this society? How do they grow up? And what Ashley and I have noticed and written about is that boys tend to go off and have adventures. Your Huck Finns, your Toby Tylers, Tom Sawyer and all of that. They go out into the world. Luke Skywalker, you've got the hero journey, and then you return triumphant. Girls, on the other hand, don't get to go have adventures. They get brought back inside. They have to learn how to sew and cook and be quiet and become good potential wives and mothers. They need to be socialized within their school, their community, their churches. So I started off writing about Künstlerroman girls in Girls Lit. So your fancy words, Bildungsroman, Künstlerroman, Entwicklungsroman, these are German terms about coming-of-age stories.
And these are words that are used with literature.
Yes, these are critical terms. Bildungsroman is just a general coming-of-age story. So something like Little Women can be seen as a Bildungsroman. Often a single book in a series isn't a Bildungsroman, but a whole series is. Künstlerroman, coming of age of an artist, someone who writes or paints or becomes an actor or actress, a poet. And Entwicklungsroman is coming of age to a degree, but not fully to adulthood. So the protagonist learns something about themselves on the path to adulthood. We could look at On the Banks of Plum Creek as an Entwicklungsroman, but the entire series as a Bildungsroman and Künstlerroman. Girls who write or girls who have imaginations are the primary texts that I use. So Betsy Ray in the Betsy Tacy books is a writer, and from an early age she is writing. Anne of Green Gables and Emily of New Moon, both writers and poets. Laura is a slightly different Künstlerroman. And also, I don't see these as static categories. It's more like a framework. What happens if we put these texts within this framework and look at them as this? So I'm well aware that not everyone would consider Little House Künstlerroman, but I certainly do. It's so much fun. What happens to these girls with imaginations, with quick tongues and tempers, who look at the world in very artistic or poetic ways? And we know that Laura in the books is going to grow up to be a writer. And we see her learning how to see things from Mary, which engages her imagination and her powers of description in certain ways. We see that essay on ambition that meant so much to her that she kept it all her life. So we see Laura growing up to become a woman who will be a writer. But then you add Rose to this, and understanding her role as a collaborator and an editor, it kind of becomes Rose's Künstlerroman too, in a way. The Laura in the books is kind of a hybrid of the real Laura and the real Rose and their experiences as girls.
So much fun to talk about, isn't it?
No, the onion peel layers of things to uncover. It never ends. There is always more to say.
You've written about Laura and a few things that I have read. I know that you contributed a chapter in a book I own called Reconsidering Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I've read other things that you've written. I'd like to ask you about an idea that you put forth that I realize I have thought about myself, perhaps not as overtly, that when we talk about Laura, it actually could be any one of a number of Lauras that we're talking about. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. And this, again, one of the things that I find so fascinating is that when people say Laura is or isn't this, okay, are you talking about Mrs. A.J. Wilder, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who sat down and wrote the books as the adult? Are you talking about the child Laura who existed historically? Are you talking about the fictional construction of Laura created by Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane? Are we talking about the TV version of Laura or the various different specials and adaptions that have come out? Are we talking about the mythological monument Laura Ingalls Wilder, children's author, writer of American history? Like, there are so many Lauras to consider. It's already hard enough to pin down an author when you're talking about Louisa May Alcott or Ellen Montgomery or Maud Hart Lovelace. But when you're talking about Laura Ingalls Wilder, even before you understand Rose's role in all of this, like, which Laura are we going to talk about? There are multiple Lauras. And then you've got Rose Wilder Lane, and it's like a marble cake. You can't separate them. It's both overwhelming and also just fascinating how many different shapes Laura can take. Every child reader has their version of Laura who was like a friend. We knew and understood her because of the books, and that version of Laura exists alongside Mrs. A.J. Wilder feeding her chickens and buying a new hat to go to Detroit for a talk.
And so it also depends on what time you're talking about.
This is why I call my class, It Was a Different Time Then. This is the reasoning that I always hear from other people when discussing problems in the texts or things that have not aged well or things that we need to question. Well, no, it's okay because it was a different time then. Yeah, that's where the conversation starts. That's not where the conversation ends. And then you've got, again, which time are we talking about in the books? Are we talking about the 1870s and 80s when the books were set? Are we talking about the 1930s and 40s when they were written? Are we talking about the 1970s from the TV show? Are we talking about the 1990s when Rose's work was really understood as being part of Laura's work? And yeah, again, what time do you want to talk about? All of these things are built in. If anyone tells you it's really very simple, nothing about this is simple.
So I'm glad that you brought up your class because I wanted to ask you about that too. You teach an online course through the Newberry Library in Chicago.
I am teaching it for the fourth year in a row. I'd have to count on my fingers. When I was living in Chicago, I took a class there at the Newberry Library, and I was blown away not only just by the resources, but also how involved they are in preserving and teaching Indigenous culture, Indigenous history, Indigenous artifacts and literature and whatnot. They have incredible resources there. And I thought, this might be a good venue where people who want to learn about Wilder and want to learn about the books or want to learn about their own childhood reading can come. And, again, part of the debate is, are people going to be confronted with these books in a university class? This way, anyone who wants to learn can come. It has been such a rewarding experience. The number of students I've had that show up so excited to share their own reading experiences and to question some of the things that they thought were odd. A lot of my students are either mothers or grandmothers who started reading the books to their kids and then went, oh my God, I didn't remember that. It's like, yep, exactly. What do we do with it? How do we engage with it? Once a year, I teach a Wilder class online. Usually my classes are on Saturdays. This one is going to be on a weeknight.
It's coming up?
Yes. So I'll be teaching Wilder for the winter term at Newberry Library. It's online, and registration goes live on January 21st. The class starts the first week of March. It's an 8-week class. Plenty of time to talk about stuff, but the best part, no essays, no marking, none of it. Just, you can come and leave your camera off and, just listen. You can come participate as much as you want. But it has been such a rewarding experience to see how many people want to engage with these books and learn from them. Problematic texts can make an excellent venue for questioning our long-held assumptions, especially books that meant a lot to us as children.
What are some of our long-held assumptions?
Probably the most obvious one is that everyone reads a book the same way, that the Laura that I experienced as a child reader in the 70s in San Diego is exactly the same as the Laura who existed for a child reader in Michigan in the 1950s. And that is so not true. But that's actually one of the benefits, is we all have our own unique versions of Laura and can share that and see how she's remained relevant because so many people can relate to her experiences as a child and a young woman growing up. The only time that this can be problematic is when a reader insists that their Laura is the only Laura. So we've experienced the confrontations where a fan will get very angry with us and, my Laura would never do that. Okay, but my Laura might. So,
and then you're back to, which Laura are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Which Laura wins? All of them.
So what is the benefit of looking at the Little House books critically?
Oh, where do we start? The idea that they're presented as, quote unquote, a true story or quote unquote historical fiction. We have such mythologized ideas in America about westward expansion and Christianity and getting married and having children, and all of these things are seen as very American ideals. And when we recognize that, hey, not all of this has held up, it gives us an opportunity to question and fine-tune things. But that's also very uncomfortable. So we'll talk about reading uncomfortably in children's literature and recognizing that our worldview isn't the only worldview, and that for someone else who is either misrepresented or erased by the Little House texts, it can be very painful reading. And once we recognize the erasures, then we can question representation of history as a whole. One of the interesting things about the people who think that I should not work on Wilder because she's racist, because of how she depicted Dr. Tan and how she depicted Native American people, actually don't go as far as I do with pointing out the racism in the text or its source. Rose, as a libertarian, was trying to craft a very specific, epic, mythologized version of America, and in doing so, she erased everyone but white Christians and the occasional token Scandinavian to provide contrast. Well, you're not a real American. So we've got a fictionalized scene where Laura goes to see the railroad being built, and Rose added this in. Laura was adamant that she never would have been taken by Pa to see the railroad being built for a number of reasons, but neither one of them acknowledged that the railroad at the time was being built by Chinese and Irish laborers, and that the Chinese people in particular were deliberately left out of the Homestead Act. All iterations of it, like, this is open for all of you except for the Chinese. Wow, let's think about Little House in that context. when you start to see whose stories were erased or the prairies look very, very different. There were communities of Black homesteaders, both from the North and the South post-Civil War. There were entire communities of Jewish homesteaders, Eastern Europeans, people who came from all over the world to, live the American dream, all erased by Rose to make it a white male epic tale. And even though it's Laura's story, it's also about Pa and Almanzo and the battle of man versus nature. And it turns out there are a lot of other people. Eliza Jane Wilder had filed on a homestead claim in De Smet because women, I think it was the third iteration of the Homestead Act, women were allowed to file on their own claims. That's a big deal. You would think that that would be mentioned in the Little House books. No, not at all. So it was a very limited view of our actual history. And when you see all of the diversities of people that were settling the Midwest and pushing westward expansion, it's a lot more complicated than we realize. So Laura and Rose presented a very masculine version of homesteading and the prairie and man versus nature and all of that stuff. And Pa and Almanzo are both presented very heroically and often did truly heroic things. Think about Almanzo and Cap Garland going after the wheat during the long winter, or even just surviving through very difficult times. But this also kind of sidelines and minimizes the women who were out on the prairie. Laura is very judgmental about Mrs. Brewster when she goes to teach and stays with the Brewsters at the beginning of these happy golden years. There's that gothic horror moment with the knife in the dark. And obviously, Laura would have been terrified. And she does not recognize that prairie madness for women is a real thing. Or maybe she did and left that out because Ma kept a stiff upper lip and made a clean breast of it. But the real dangers for women out there are minimized in a lot of ways. Rose, in particular, tends to highlight the men in these communities. And interestingly enough, another one of her fabricated moments in Little Town on the Prairie is when Pa takes part in a minstrel show. And again, this is one of the contentious parts of the book. We see Black representation in Dr. Tan and then minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was already falling out of favor in the 1940s. Why would Rose put this kind of scene in here? This is also something that, I'm very aware that I am a white woman talking about this, but also that's me using my privilege to engage with these things. So Rose gives us this scene where Pa is a quote-unquote darky rattling the bones in a minstrel group, and Ma and Laura are both worried that, if that's Pa, where are his whiskers? Did he shave off his whiskers? He wouldn't do that. And then they go home and see that his whiskers are still intact, but he's got a little bit of grease paint on his face that they can recognize. If you understand minstrelsy and the languages in minstrelsy, the codes that are presented, the idea that you can black up with cork, perform as a quote-unquote darky, and then wipe that cork off and become white again, reinforces that white masculinity. This is Rose making sure that we know that Pa is a white man in a time and place where you have to be a white man to survive. So being able to recognize the language of minstrelsy is something that has fallen out of favor. Like, we grew up with the Looney Tunes cartoons and, seeing Bugs Bunny, Mickey Mouse. These are all coded minstrel performances. The gloves, the exaggerated mouths, and sometimes there will be accidents that actually give them literal blackface. Ha ha. But again, this language is part of our popular culture because every single element of American pop culture, whether it's our foods, our sporting events, sitcoms, it is all filtered through the experience of Black people removed from their homes in African countries and sent to the Caribbean and the American South to be enslaved. All of our popular culture is framed that way. Everything from the way jokes are told in stand-up comedy, the way sitcoms are framed and have certain beats or certain tropes and certain stock characters. All of this is filtered through minstrelsy. A really good book on this is Phil Nell's Was the Cat in the Hat Black? Minstrelsy is a strange form of both validating and disenfranchising Black artists and Black people. And we have to recognize that history and see the roots where all of this comes from.
So was it anachronistic for Rose to introduce it? Was this something that was happening in the 1870s? I know you said it had fallen out of favor by the 1940s, the time in which they were writing the books. But what about in the 19th century?
Minstrelsy was the leading form of entertainment, and there were troupes that would travel to various towns and entertain. There were also costumes and scripts that you could order and put on in your own town, and it would give you instructions on how to black up. And of course, all of the music was well known. So many of the songs that Pa plays on his fiddle are vaudeville tunes, are Civil War songs, are songs that came from Black work songs. Yeah, this was the main form of entertainment in the 19th century and on through the early parts of the 20th century, especially as stage performances moved to movies.
What are the texts that are in your syllabus? Is it just the Little House series?
When I teach Wilder, I do the whole series, and I also include Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires, Pamela Smith Hill's Pioneer Girl. That's probably one of the key texts to go back to, as well as some of Rose's books, because most people haven't read Rose's individual texts. So something like Young Pioneers, which was Let the Hurricane Roar, and how she wrote the On the Banks of Plum Creek story before Laura published hers. Old Hometown is another interesting book that Rose wrote. It is essentially her growing up in Mansfield, in a small town where you really see the community and the pressure of living in a small community. And if you make one misstep, you are never going to hear the end of it. Your reputation will be ruined for the rest of your life. So seeing those dynamics and social interactions is also really helpful. It's all presented through the character's name is Ernestine, who is pretty much a stand-in for Rose. So seeing Rose's perspective of her parents is also very interesting, and her relationship dynamic with both Laura and Almanzo, her mother and her father. She may have been a bit of a daddy's girl, and we all know that she and Laura clashed a lot. Thinking about those dynamics when she's someone other than quote-unquote baby Rose from the first 4 years changes the way we see the books too.
Are any of the people taking your classes surprised to learn about Rose's role, or do they usually know?
Most of them are gobsmacked to find out. Often they haven't reread the books until they sign up for the class, or have just reread a couple and want to learn more. So when they find out that instead of this being the mythic Laura Ingalls Wilder, it's actually a collaborative effort between mother and daughter, two writers. It kind of blows people away, but that's kind of the first Wilder loss of innocence, I think. We get touches of it when we read the first 4 years as children and go, why is this different? And then when you find out that, oh, wait a minute, the monumental Laura Ingalls Wilder in my head doesn't exist, and it's actually Laura Wilder and Rose Lane, and, it's like finding out that Santa Claus isn't real.
Yeah.
And then we get to find out more about two very complicated, very interesting, very difficult American figures and how they presented American history to us as children. To me, it only makes the history of the books more interesting and makes me want to study them more. But I do know that a lot of people have trouble with Rose's involvement. The people who will, well, I don't believe she really... Okay, you can not believe that I don't believe that Rose really had all that to do with the books. All right, but we've read the rough drafts, and yeah, she did. But then we're back to facts versus faith, or belief versus what actually happened, and that always gets messy.
You've mentioned thinking about critical theory and critical thinking as a toolbox. Can you explain that a little bit?
People can be so intimidated by scary words like theory or critical thinking. And I found that a lot of people, even when they're saying no one thinks critically anymore, they think that critical thinking means criticizing someone else. They don't understand that it's a series of questions and different approaches. My PhD supervisor, Maria, taught critical theory as a toolbox. You're not going to use the same tools for every task. If you need to fix a watch, you're not going to take out a hammer. If you need to put together your IKEA bookcase, you're going to be really glad that you have an Allen wrench in there. Theory is a way of doing different tasks with different tools. If I want to look at how Ma and other women in the community and how her daughters grow up in the Little House books, I'll use feminist theory and talk about the roles of women and girls in their community. I'd use different tools if I want to look at the erasure of Native Americans or the misrepresentation of Native Americans in those texts. So thinking critically means being able to ask questions of texts in productive ways. So when we think about who's left out and how would this story change if those who are left out actually had a voice in these stories, that's using critical thinking. One of the ways I'll approach this in class is talking about the illustrations, Garth Williams' illustrations in particular, which were revolutionary at the time. They were relying on realistic representation. And I think Laura even said something like, Pa, Ma, Mary, Laura, and Carrie live again in these new illustrations. And when you compare them to other illustrations in the 1950s, these are way more respectful of how Native Americans are depicted. Usually they were caricatures, they were something to be feared. And when you look at these illustrations and see how carefully Williams researched the Osage to include details of their clothing, to include details of what the prairie actually looked like, it seems really respectful. And so people will say to me, but I don't understand what the problem is. And then you have to point out that he also used the same Osage research to depict Lakota Sioux in D. Smith, who did not wear their hair like that, who wore very different clothing. And, wait a minute, okay, this is actually a problem. So on the surface, I didn't see what was wrong with it, but just a couple of questions like, okay, I can see how this is misrepresentation. Here's what people in that part of the Dakotas, indigenous people, actually wore and looked like. My grandma actually grew up on the Rosebud Indian Reservation, which is about 200 miles southwest, I believe, of De Smet.
In South Dakota?
Yeah, it was South Dakota when she was there, but it was Dakota Territory when the books were set. So I remember asking her questions about the Indians, and I think it was the heaped big snow in the long winter. And she was able to tell me, I mean, she grew up in the 1930s and 40s. So when the books were being written, that's where she was living. And she was, she would tell me, no, they didn't talk like that, even though heap big snow, that is actually a real thing that happened in the books, but it gets exaggerated. So it's less about an actual historical event and more about Tonto, who was Native American representation at the time. So I'll point out the similarities between Big Jerry, again, someone who probably really existed, and his depictions in the books. Lone Ranger and Tonto came out about the same time. This is, Wild West and Western movies and Louis L'Amour and Zane Grey and the books that Laura was actually reading at the time she was writing the Little House books.
Are you ready for some rapid fire Little House questions?
Oh, yes. Oh, I've been waiting for this.
What is your favorite Garth Williams illustration?
It's the one of Pa holding Laura on his lap and cuddling her in Little House in the Big Woods. My dad was long gone. I did not have that kind of safety or comfort in my home, and it went completely over my head at the time that this is after Pa has just whipped 5-year-old Laura with a razor strap. Mixed bag indeed.
What Little House phrases do you say out loud on a regular basis?
I will say modulate your voice, Laura, but the one that I use most of all is from the TV shows.
Really?
Jezebel, flaunt your flesh in temptation's raiment, you will burn.
What is the name of that episode?
Whisper County. It's Miss Peel when Mary goes
Whisper
to
County.
teach it. Yeah, apparently the prairie backs up to Appalachia when you're filming in Simi Valley.
I recently discovered personally that episode may not be the very first episode I ever watched in primetime, but it's definitely the first one I remember.
Oh,
watching.
that will burn itself into your psyche. Of course, we all
It
have trauma
really, it really did. It really did.
Sylvia and a rat infestation and all of that. Yeah, it was, yeah. Poor Gen X kids. We were so traumatized by family entertainment.
We really were. What vocabulary did you specifically learn from the books?
Sober. It was the first time I ever heard it used to mean something other than related to alcohol, that someone could be sober as a judge or something like that. And that wasn't referred to, the opposite of drunk, but yeah.
Yeah, Pa was sober a lot.
Oh, yeah. Ma wouldn't have let him be unsober.
What scene would you like to drop yourself into?
Anything with the food, like the Christmas scene in Farmer Boy. Oh, this is something that I'd forgotten until recently. That scene during Christmas where Almanzo's looking at the table and someone is sawing away the white breast of the goose. That didn't seem out of the ordinary when I was a kid, of course. I'd seen a turkey. A goose was probably the same. Well, I found out later that geese don't have white meat. It was dark meat. The books can actually misrepresent something. I was adamant that geese had white meat because I'd read it in Wilder, and then you actually find out, oh, hey, here's a goose. It does not have white meat. It's okay to learn things and change your mind. But yeah, the kind of visceral relationship with food coming from someone who had been hungry so often in her life really comes through.
Are there any scenes or chapters that you skip?
I tend to skip the really sad, devastating scenes in The Long Winter. There's kind of an odd coziness about rereading that, especially, during the pandemic. A lot of people returned to The Long Winter. But it's a tough go, especially when you see how hard they're struggling and how hard the whole town is struggling. So yeah, I tend to skip over those.
If someone who hasn't read the books is interested in them, what book from the series do you hand them?
I tend to go with Little Town on the Prairie, especially with my work on girls' literature. This is where we see Laura as a young girl growing into a young woman in her community, learning all of the different societal expectations, taking part in things that make her uncomfortable or nervous, but she has to learn how to perform girlhood and perform young womanhood in a certain way. So I find it fascinating that it starts off with her being terrified to go into town, and it ends with her standing up in front of the whole town, reciting American history. Talk about socialization.
If you personally are about to just read one book from the series, which one do you reach for?
The child in me reaches for On the Banks of Plum Creek, but as an adult reader, I tend to keep returning to The First 4 Years. It was a book
Really?
that I did not like it at all as a child reader. Most of us didn't. But as an adult, this is the closest we get to Laura's own undiluted voice without Rose editing. And we get to see the story of a young woman who is struggling for economic control of her household and her marriage, because her father was more than a little feckless, and it turns out her husband might be too. Like, just give it a week with the diphtheria before you try to hitch up the horses, Manly. Come on. But yeah, seeing her understanding of the world, seeing her as a woman and a young wife trying to figure out how to be married in a way that doesn't destroy her. It's a revelation, and it's really fascinating to hear Laura's voice undiluted or, minimally diluted compared to the earlier books. And I'm actually really glad that we have that text as part of the series. That's another step with critical thinking. Hey, why does this book sound different? It's because, and then we find out when she wrote it, that she put it away and didn't finish it, and how many hardships they dealt with in those first 4 years, the first 3 years in A Year of Grace.
So you're currently preparing for your next class. And again, when does registration begin for that?
Registration opens on January 21st.
Ooh, so in just about 2 weeks. You also have your online Girls Lit reading group. Do you want to tell listeners about that?
So Ashley and I, Ashley Reese, the awesomest writing partner that a girl has ever had. We have a reading group that meets every other month on girls' literature. It's through Hollins University. I will make sure that you have the link to that. We are always looking for people to join, whether you are just a casual reader or a scholar or a parent or grandparent who's rediscovering some of these books. There is room for you, and we meet every other month with a book that has been selected by the group. Last month, we talked about Anastasia Krupnik, which I had never read and was just delightful. Anyone who's interested in girls lit and books that may or may not be traditionally defined as girls lit, come play. We have a good time.
So here's some information for listeners who are interested in either the Girls Lit group or the Laura Ingalls Wilder class. The Girls Lit group can be found at hollinsgirlslit.wordpress.com. That's HOLLINS girlslit.wordpress.com. And the Laura Ingalls Wilder class will be a 6-week class on Thursday evenings from 6 to 8 p.m. Central, starting on March 5th with the last class on April 23rd. You can find that info on the Newberry Library website, newberry.org/calendar/little-house, or just go to the homepage, click on Learn, and then click on Adult Education Classes. So bookmark that, and registration will go live on January 21st. So there's the class, there's the Girls Lit group. Should we talk about anything else?
Actually, right now, there are plans for an academic conference on Wilder and Lane in 2027.
Ooh.
Self and a few other Wilder scholars have been talking about this. We're going to put together a steering committee and see about a hybrid online and in-person academic conference on Wilder. There has not been anything like this. Gatherings tend to be more fan-based or based on the TV show, which again are important approaches. And we need academic space to have these difficult conversations and talk about how to effectively teach or what questions we can ask. But also how to support each other and make sure that we have safe spaces to discuss these texts without, getting death threats or people trying to destroy our careers, because that happens too.
Wow, that is so great that you're going to provide that. I am excited. Dawn, for many reasons, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. You were an absolute delight.
Oh, this has just been fantastic, Sandra. Thank you so much. There's always so much to talk about. Put a couple Wilder people together and we just start yammering.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Academic conference on Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane for 2027. This is some wild, unexpected news, and hopefully Dawn will keep us updated as any plans come together. Definitely visit the Girls Lit group or the Laura Ingalls Wilder class at the Newberry Library if you are interested. So many great things out there in the Land of Laura. Speaking of Land of Laura, the podcast is created and executive produced by me, Sandra Hume. Special thanks to Canadian folk punk band The Dreadnaughts for our theme music, and extra special thanks to all the guests, like Dawn, who give so generously of their time and knowledge. I hope to see you next time. Make sure you subscribe to Land of Laura on your favorite podcast channel so you can hear about episodes as soon as they drop. As Pa says, there's plenty more down cellar in a teacup, and as Ma might have said, it takes all kinds of people to make a little house world.